The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Today, with US-China relations still tense, it is gaining ever more significance as a global security hub. In its first virtual seminar of 2021, the Democracy Forum will explore this crucial territory and its role as a sphere of power and influence. These are just some of the questions that will be addressed at this highly topical event. Please join us and our panel of experts for a live discussion, bringing your own comments, questions and insights.
Hello and welcome wherever you are in the world to this Democracy Forum seminar, the first of 2021, hours before America gets a new president, to look at the shifting focus on the hot foreign policy topic of the day, the Indo-Pacific, and does it hold the key to containing China? We have with us an exceptionally experienced panel: Baroness Frances de Souza, Professor Brahma Chellaney, Dr. Lynn Kuok, Dr. Neil Melvin. They're going to be discussing views from the Western democracies, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, and from here in post-Brexit United Kingdom, looking for a global role. Each will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, after which we're going to open to questions. And please challenge, contradict, give us a kick so that we think differently. Write your questions in the Q&A box and I will feed them in to enrich our discussion that will be deftly wrapped up at the end by Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardiner, Labour Member of Parliament and former Shadow International Trade Secretary. But first, before going to the panel, we turn to Lord Charles Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, to lay out for us the canvas and set the tone for our debate. Lord Bruce.
Welcome to another opportunity hosted by the Democracy Forum to look closely at the strategic consequences of China's increasing domination of the Indo-Pacific region. It is indeed poignant that our webinar coincides today with the inauguration of President-elect Biden and the likely resetting of America's foreign policy goals, of which the most important, arguably, must be the re-evaluation of the threat posed by China to the interests of the United States and its allies. I'd like to thank the team at the Democracy Forum for arranging this important event today and for assembling such an outstanding panel of experts. I wish them well in their deliberations, and I'd like to emphasize again that a great deal of the success of our video conferences is due to the role of our moderator, Humphrey Hawksley, who will ensure undoubtedly that this webinar is both informative and entertaining for you. In recent months, the Forum and its sister publication, Asian Affairs, has given regular coverage to the many issues arising from the impact of China's projection of state power. Our invited panelists have examined several aspects of China's internal and external security, most notably the fate of Tibet and Taiwan. But today, our focus has switched to the question of China's containment, and more precisely to the likely policy choices which the incoming Biden administration may seek to deploy in this regard. For the past 3 years, United States policy towards the Indo-Pacific has been predicated on the basis of its need to contain and control the growing threat of Beijing's strategic and economic ambitions. Indeed, the declassification of President Trump's 2018 strategic framework for the region was one of the many unexpected consequences flowing from the occupation of the Capitol building by his supporters earlier this month. The subsequent resignation of Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger on the 7th of January and the simultaneous release of previously classified documents has provided perhaps the clearest insight yet into the formulation of the outgoing administration's China calculus. Pottinger, in a surprisingly revealing speech to the Policy Exchange last October, insisted that America's approach to China rested securely on the twin pillars of reciprocity and candor. He reserved his withering scorn for the Chinese government's attempt to manipulate the sensibility of the international community, a process which he described as a paradoxical mindset, a state of cognitive dissonance that is at once credulous and fearful, complacent and defeatist. It's a mindset that on Monday says it's too early to say whether Beijing poses a threat, and by Friday says they're a threat all right, but it's too late to do anything about it now. Early indications suggest that a Biden presidency is unlikely fundamentally to question the skepticism. The new appointee as Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who served as a foreign policy advisor to the Obama administration, was recorded in an interview given to the Hudson Institute last August, where he gave several important indications about how a future Biden administration will handle its relationship with China. Blinken emphasizes the importance of fostering a collective response to China's growing hegemony. And perhaps this is where the incoming administration will differ. Indeed, he feels that a significant deficiency of the Trump era's approach to contending with China is it's done so not with our allies and partners, but without them. Indeed, while alienating them, we need to rally our allies and partners instead of alienating them to deal with the challenge that China poses. In contending with the challenge posed by China, America's allies are faced by distinctly different threats and opportunities. Whereas India and Japan are both involved in long-running wrangles over disputed territory in the Eastern Himalayas and the South China Sea, Australia and New Zealand are now confronted with the legacy of allowing China to become a dominant trading partner. Indeed, a New Zealand political scientist, Anne-Marie Brady, who has long researched the insidious reach of China's United Front Work Department, warns her fellow Antipodeans that Beijing seeks to corrode and corrupt our political system, to weaken and divide us against each other, to erode the critical voice of our media, and turn our elites into clients of the Chinese Communist Party, their mouths stuffed with cash. I suspect that Brady's words will not be lost on members of the European Parliament as they debate the ratification of the China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which the European Commission concluded at the end of December. President-elect Biden's team were quick to urge caution on their European partners. Newly appointed National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan tweeted that the new administration would welcome early consultations with our European partners on our common concerns about China's economic practices. And this, I suggest, is the critical issue which will come to define how the United States is able to square up to China, by re-engaging with its allies and reactivating the moral authority it once held. As the Financial Times Washington editor Edward Luce said recently, in dealing with China, a Biden presidency needs to deploy conscious ideological opposition, which has been lacking in American diplomacy since the Gulf War. Well, today's inauguration in Washington falls exactly 60 years after John F. Kennedy was sworn in as president. In defining the mood of the time, his address focused on the consequences of the ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. But he pledged America to begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, he said, but let us never fear to negotiate. Well, we watch with interest to see how Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. refers to China in his inaugural address this afternoon. Thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today, and I hope you will learn a great deal from it.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, hitting some sharp arguments there. Europe's relationship with China, Britain's relationship, the US's relationship. One of the key points you mentioned there was that the allies, bringing the allies together, whereas China doesn't really have any allies at all. So how is that going to work if the tensions continue? But we're now going to go to Baroness Frances de Souza, a crossbench member and former Speaker of the House of Lords. And she's going to be talking about the democratic process. And before I hand over to you, I just want to say, I think it was 2011 or 2012, Joe Biden gave a speech at Chongqing University about the Chinese-American relationship without mentioning human rights or democracy once. And now everybody amongst the Western things is talking about human rights, genocide even, democracy, and bringing an alliance of democracies forward. So Baroness Frances de Souza is going to talk about the democratic process, its influence, if any, on China's imperial reach within the context of the Indo-Pacific region. The screen is yours, Lady de Souza.
Thank you very much indeed, and good day or good evening to everyone. I'm delighted to be here. The focus of today's discussion is predominantly on the economic and security aspects of the Indo-Pacific pivot, but I'd like to look briefly at the democratic influences at work both between the nations of the region and in particular the role of China in obstructing such democratic developments. How pervasive and growing is China's threat to democracy in the region? What might be the regional, if not the international consequences, and what is to be done? I make no apology for focusing on this seemingly less hard influence. We know to our cost that democracies prosper better than autocracies. So if economic growth is to be achieved in the Indo-Pacific region, it has to be underpinned by good governance, adherence to the rule of law, and to common international standards. What does the current regime in China add to, if anything, or detract from tentative democratic developments? And what are the consequences of the pivot by the USA, UK, and others to the region? How far does China's power challenge liberal democratic values? In what ways, and what might a pushback program look like? What incentives do the established Indo-Pacific nations, USA, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and India, offer in providing a rules-based political and economic order? Does China wish to reshape a regional order that has hitherto promoted shared prosperity, economic connectivity, and political liberalization? And if the latter, then the current strategy of riding roughshod over democratic norms cannot be optimal in the longer term. Stringent sanctions and forceful rhetoric about China's current policies in Hong Kong and Xinjiang are unlikely to promote change. But the PRC is by no means invulnerable. No nation, China included, welcomes censure from the international community, while the USA has a widespread array of partners and allies in the region. China has few. The recent efforts on the part of China to use foreigners to extol the virtues of its policies is a manifestation of the concern to quieten the world and reassure the domestic audience. Some commentators also point to areas of vulnerability in resources. China is acutely aware that empires tend to crumble from within. China's tactics of influence are many and varied. For example, the purchase of agricultural produce from regional suppliers in part to create dependence and to increase support from farmers. or equally economic punishment of those countries that appear to favor USA investment in defense components, as in South Korea, and or claims on the Senkaku Islands, as in Japan, undoubtedly affects economic, cultural, and even social freedoms. China also has an impact on democratic norms abroad, as seen in, for example, Chinese students' efforts, which are often successful, to interfere with freedom of speech in Australia on topics such as Taiwan's independence and the Hong Kong protests. Additionally, China has had significant censoring influence on the Western film and media industries. And then we come, of course, to the Belt and Road Initiative. Evidence shows that once embedded, Chinese state-owned firms work to undermine democratic institutions in those countries where they are most active. Mechanisms include weakening anti-corruption measures and undermining nascent democratic institutions. The proliferation of BRI has at the same time extended the reach of very dubious Chinese practices globally. One stark example of China's power and intentions is in the Indo-Pacific region is, of course, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, where China has contrived successfully to lease a key harbor with direct access to international shipping lanes. This astonishing territorial move seems to indicate that both state-owned and private companies have their eyes on long-term geostrategic aims rather than purely profit, which is in itself a challenge to the rules-based order. China's illiberal actions in Hong Kong and Taiwan also demonstrate the wider regional plans. The hope of some kind of coordinated international pushback against current repressive measures in Hong Kong is, I think, fading fast. The innovative and courageous developments in Taiwan to reduce China's power and prevent a potential territorial claim, such as President Tsai's new southbound policy, has been countered with covert Chinese support of anti-independent voices in that country, destroying trust in democratic institutions and people's belief in their long-term future as an independent nation. While there's yet to be a full evaluation of the effect of such tactics, it's already clear that China has most influence in those nations in both Africa and Asia that have a weak state capacity, undue poverty, and a deep need for infrastructural investment. Given that the requirements for major Belt and Road investments are less demanding than those asked by the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, it's understandable that weaker nations opt for the Chinese solution. And this too leads to a general fragmenting of potential regional cooperation and erodes democratic development within nations. Despite the deep concern about China's growing influence in and beyond the region, there is as yet no coherent democratic alternative to combat these aggressive developments. Apart from, obviously, India, commonly known as the largest democratic nation, the move towards democracy is a relatively recent phenomenon in most of Asia and has many different roots. When democracy is in global retreat in the West, as we see too often, however, it's very heartening to see it take tentative hold in countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia, albeit with continued weaknesses. Experts have pondered the reasons for the absence of a united front against Chinese inroads, and a persuasive case has been forwarded by Karis Templeman. He argues that the route to the very different forms of democracy in the region are so diverse and the systems so different that there is no acceptance of common values, let alone coordinated practices. Certainly, there are nations in the region that don't even begin to nod towards democratic norms, Laos, for instance, North Korea, but others have taken definite steps. The best possible antidote to Chinese inroads would be a formal coalition of regional and US, UK, and other European states to agree on measures to establish and reinforce a sustainable rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. These could include focus and cooperation on trade and technology, diplomacy, governance, climate change, and environmental protection. Membership of the CPTPP is widely believed to be urgent and important and would link membership to 13% of global domestic product. investment in international partnership programs on good governance, climate change, humanitarian assistance, technology growth, and a different and less corrupt, perhaps, Belt and Road initiative would make a very big difference. Other urgent initiatives might encompass an Indo-Pacific investment mechanism to support US and regional economic programs, as well as a multinational investment treaty that would protect investors from discriminatory practices and enable investors to arbitrate where necessary under the umbrella of international law. That said, there's been no shortage of significant democracy building projects in the region in the last 20 years or so, chiefly by the USA. The question is, have such programs made a difference? Most particularly in halting the spread of Chinese power. If the purpose of these programs has been to contribute to a stable order whereby no single power can dominate, the answer is probably no, that have not made much difference. Development and capacity building schemes are always difficult to evaluate, but it is also the case that there is a lack of coordination or of long-term commitment to these initiatives within and between the countries in the region, and this may signal to China that they are not to be taken seriously. A major multi-nation program of investment, coupled with an equally focused attention on soft power possibilities, has to be the way forward. Meanwhile, established democracies in the region will have to continue demonstrating their democratic credentials, such as freedoms, protection of minorities, and upholding civil liberties, while at the same time engaging with China on specific collaborative projects. Lastly, more recent and alarming moves on the part of China have brought renewed focus to the area, and it is to be hoped that future investments in democracy building will now be carefully planned and executed with an emphasis on coordination and the presentation of a common front. Thank you, and I look forward to comments.
Thank you so much for that. Before we move on, can I just ask you about this word democracy? Because we've had it here in Britain with Brexit and we've just seen what's happened in the US. Is it wise, do you think, for Europe and the US to go under the new US administration or post-Brexit Britain into the Indo-Pacific region, flying this democratic flag, when you've got allies like Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and when in fact, is it not what we're talking about is rule of law and accountability? I mean, could you?
I couldn't agree more. I think that it is an unfortunate term, and it has connotations in the Indo-Pacific region which are not very welcome. Also, of course, there are so many different forms of democracy, and I mean, some are sort of transitional, some are sort of more fully fledged. And of course, what you have in Singapore is a full democracy, but a party that is unduly powerful, which therefore doesn't allow the institutions of democracy to work as they might. I do think that what you said, Humphrey, about sort of focusing on the rule of law and a new world order, which allows for collaboration on specific programs, is a much preferable way of, as it were, announcing or waving the flag to the Indo-Pacific region. I do think that we ought to let go of the term democracy. It probably is no longer as useful as it used to be.
We need a new word, don't we, really? We need a new thing.
We need a word. New world order. New world economic order. Yeah.
You can see the initials that are going to come out of that. Now, Lady de Souza has to leave us shortly, but she is going to vote in the chamber, I think, and then you are
to debate in the chamber.
To the debate in the chamber. Then you hopefully
I'll come back.
Back for the question and answer session. So anybody you want to trip up, send in your questions.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm going to stay here till about 2:45.
Oh, fine. Okay.
I look forward to others.
All right, then. Well, we now move to Professor Brahma Chellaney, whose Twitter handle describes him as a strategic thinker, author, and commentator based in Delhi. but I know for a fact that he has ear within corridors of power all around the world. I last had the privilege of sharing a panel with Brahma at the Jaipur Literary Festival a few years back, and he is going to tell us about the future of the US-led free and open, it's another phrase, isn't it? Free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Brahma, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Humphrey. Joe Biden is taking charge of the US as the oldest person ever sworn in as American president. Biden's inauguration comes at a time when the United States is more divided than ever, and its global primacy confronts increasing challenge and erosion. After Donald Trump's tumultuous presidency, Biden's policy decisions will have a profound bearing on the state of American power and security across the free world. Those decisions will determine whether his presidency will reverse or accelerate America's relative decline. Biden's real test will be the Indo-Pacific region, which is the world's geopolitical and economic hub, a region that will determine the future of American power. China is reshaping the Indo-Pacific landscape with its heavy-handed use of economic and military power and its aggressive expansionism, which extends from the Himalayas and Hong Kong to the South and East China Seas. Its next target could be Taiwan. Today, a rules-based and democracy-led order in the Indo-Pacific has become more important than ever to ensure power stability. By power stability, I mean by a stable balance of power. If the region's major democracies, from the US and Canada to Indonesia and India, leverage their growing strategic bonds to generate progress toward a broader concert of democracies, the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific may be realized. The concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific was authored by then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe before Trump was elected. It was then embraced by the Trump administration. Rarely has the US adopted a foreign design concept as the linchpin of its foreign policy. Today, China's aggressive expansionism is driving even distant powers like the UK, France, and Germany to view a pluralistic, rules-based Indo-Pacific as central to international peace and security. France, for example, has unveiled its own Indo-Pacific strategy that affirms the region's importance in any stable, law-based, multipolar global order. And Germany, which held the European Council's presidency until recently, sought to help build an Indo-Pacific strategy for the European Union by releasing its own Indo-Pacific policy guidelines, which call for measures to ensure that rules prevail over a might makes right approach in the region. Trump may have weakened the transatlantic alliance, but in the Indo-Pacific, his administration has built the Quad into a promising coalition and upgraded security ties with key partners, including Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, Indonesia, and Thailand. It has also established new defense cooperation with Vietnam and the Maldives. Biden has yet to spell out his approach to the Indo-Pacific. There are signs, though, that Biden may replace the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy with a new policy. The Indo-Pacific strategy that he adopts will be his most consequential foreign policy decision. It is important to note that even the widely used term Indo-Pacific was missing from Biden's campaign statements and from the 2020 Democratic Party platform. In place of Indo-Pacific, the party platform repeatedly used the term Asia-Pacific, which China prefers. After his election, Biden started referring to the Indo-Pacific in calls with Asian leaders, but not to a free and open Indo-Pacific. Till today, he has not used this phrase, free and open Indo-Pacific. Instead, Biden has coined a new phrase, secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Biden thus far has given no indication how his secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific policy will be different from the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. But the new phrase he is using carries an ominous implication. Unlike a free and open Indo-Pacific, a secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific, by definition, won't exclude autocracies like China. Free and open meant a rules-based and democracy-led order. A secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific, by contrast, would imply the abandonment of that goal, or at least its dilution. Important democracies today are looking to Biden to provide strategic clarity on his approach to the Indo-Pacific. Holding a large summit for democracy, as he plans to do, can scarcely offer such clarity. The summit would represent a values-based, globalized approach. That approach would stand in sharp contrast to the Trump administration strategy of regionally leveraging cooperation with democracies for geopolitical ends. Biden has claimed in a New York Times interview that the US doesn't have leverage against China as yet. In reality, the Trump administration has handed the Biden administration important leverage that the Biden team could capitalize on and deal with Beijing from a position of strength. From Richard Nixon to Barack Obama, successive US presidents aided China's rise. It was the Trump administration that engineered a paradigm shift in US policy. The development of a genuinely bipartisan China policy under Trump was remarkable, given the hardened polarization in Washington. If the Biden administration seeks to paint the Trump team's China legacy in unflattering light, it will undermine the leverage the US currently has, and will embolden Beijing to demand the repudiation and rollback of Trump's actions. And those actions extend from trade tariffs to the blacklisting of Chinese companies linked with the PLA. In fact, President Xi Jinping's regime is hoping that Biden will return to the accommodationist approach of the Obama period, when China created artificial islands and militarized the South China Sea without inviting US sanctions or any other international costs. The pressure that the Trump administration ramped up on China has exacted a heavy toll on Beijing, denting its international image. As a Pew Research Center survey has revealed, negative views of China reached historic highs last year. Against this background, Beijing clearly saw Biden's election win as a silver lining for China. For example, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang, reposing China's hope in Biden, said earlier this month that a new window of hope is opening and that the bilateral relationship with the US could now get back on the right track following a period of unprecedented difficulty. The Biden administration, in my view, can bring sustained multilateral pressure to bear on Beijing if it provides leadership, vision, and resolve. Otherwise, as the recent Chinese investment deal with the European Union underscores, Beijing will use the lure of the vast Chinese market to divide the democratic world and to forestall a united front against China. Absence of strategic clarity and resolve in Biden's Indo-Pacific policy will have major consequences, including for American power. It will also spur India to have second thoughts about aligning itself too closely with Washington, and it will lead to Japan's remilitarization. Against this background, an important question arises. Will the Biden administration provide US leadership and resolve in the Indo-Pacific? Humphrey mentioned the word reset. A US reset of Indo-Pacific and China policies will have a major fallout. Resetting ties with China implies new bases of bilateral ties with mutual concessions. So resetting involves an overhaul of the existing American policy toward China. The worst choice the Biden team can make is to seek shared leadership or quote unquote managed coexistence with Beijing in the Indo-Pacific. Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, in an essay in the journal Foreign Affairs, has advocated managed coexistence with Beijing. Managed coexistence with Beijing could be cleverly camouflaged with the Biden administration's public statements giving comfort to both advocates of a tough approach toward China and to advocates of a grand bargain with Beijing, even as Washington quietly works with Beijing in areas of common interest and settles for shared leadership, that is, managed coexistence in the Indo-Pacific. This approach will not only allow China to stay on the path of aggressive authoritarianism, but also set in motion America's unstoppable decline. Make no mistake, without a coherent strategy under Biden, backed by political resolve and strategic heft, China's expansionism will destabilize the Indo-Pacific further, with Taiwan likely to be the next target. Thank you.
Made me think of it. Lots of questions. Secure and prosperous that you mentioned against the free and open. This is, to simplify, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific has been embraced even by European powers. The UK has embraced the free and open Indo-Pacific concept in its policy. France, Germany, Netherlands, and Portugal, which is now the new European Council president, is also pushing for a free and open Indo-Pacific.
But are these merely slogans? Because the man on the street doesn't really understand what they mean. Do they have a great sort of policy depth to them?
Yes, they do. Because the term free and open means a democracy-led order, a rule of law in the Indo-Pacific. Secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific would include an autocracy like China. It does not exclude any autocracy. Gotcha. And it certainly no longer, when you say secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific, you're not talking about a rules-based democracy-led order in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a significant change. But as I mentioned, Biden has not unveiled his Indo-Pacific policy as yet. So we have to wait and watch. But the new phrase that he has coined does raise some concern.
You put up a warning about managed coexistence and that phrase there, but isn't it that the fact that Asia, India, and the will have to have a managed coexistence with China, whatever unfolds? And so is Biden and Biden's people going to be moving into a very different Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific than was there 4 years ago? Is there a different mindset now in Asia?
Well, managed coexistence, as articulated by Jake Sullivan in an essay that he co-authored with Kurt Campbell, who is becoming the Indo-Pacific coordinator in Biden's National Security Council. Mm-hmm. That concept that they outline, managed coexistence, is about creating a G2, a US-China arrangement in the world, which other countries will have to adjust to or accept. Now, this kind of shared leadership that they're talking about implicitly in that essay, but the term managed coexistence has been used in that essay, that concept has been welcomed by Beijing. In fact, there was an op-ed in the New York Times in November written by a former Chinese vice foreign minister. She also spoke about managed coexistence. She talked about how the US and China could have both the cooperative and competitive elements in a relationship that seeks to respect each other's primary concerns. That's what managed coexistence is.
Just before I let you go, because I just wanted to, it's so that Asia itself, the alliances or the relationships between, say, India and Japan, Japan and Australia, these things, they've increased during the Trump administration. Are they strong enough now to see off a managed coexistence, a G2 situation?
Well, what we have is that the Quad, which is the Australia, India, Japan, US, loose strategic alliance, that Quad is now on the cusp of becoming a formal institution, thanks to the efforts of the Trump administration. And also the bilateral relationships in the Quad between India and Japan, Japan and Australia, Australia and India, India and the US, those bilateral relationships have also acquired greater strategic meaning. For example, all these four powers now are collaborating in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of holding joint exercises, military exercises. They had a naval exercise jointly in November in the Indian Ocean region,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Malabar exercise. So it shows how rapidly the Quad has acquired concrete shape. It has sharpened its edges and become central to the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy.
Okay, that's great. I'm now going to move on with this idea of managed coexistence and secure and prosperous to Southeast Asia and Dr. Lynn Kuok, who's been quarantining everywhere from our pre-discussion things. I can't remember where you are at the moment, but you're just free from hotel rooms and COVID tests. But Lynn is just about connected with every blue chip think tank imaginable. She's a senior fellow for Asia Pacific Security at the Institute for International and Strategic Studies, a visiting professor at Georgetown University, senior fellow at the University of Cambridge, and formerly Brookings, Yale, Harvard, and Shangri-La Dialogue, the big annual Singaporean event. Lynn is going to give us the view that we just got there from Southeast Asia. Lynn, the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Humphrey, and my thanks as well to the Democracy Forum and Lord Bruce for the invitation to speak on this panel today. I think the topic we're discussing is a very important one, and as Humphrey mentioned, I'll be providing the perspective from Southeast Asia, a region that is at the very heart of the Indo-Pacific and is one of the main battlegrounds for US-China strategic competition. Before I move on to respond to the question posed in today's panel, I'd like to briefly address what Professor Chellaney mentioned about how managed coexistence might suggest a softer approach from the Biden administration. The article he highlights from Foreign Affairs, it was actually jointly authored by Kurt Campbell, the new Indo-Pacific SAR, as well as Jake Sullivan, the newly appointed National Security Advisor. And the title of that article in Foreign Affairs is actually Competition Without Catastrophe. So perhaps another reading of managed coexistence is not a softer approach necessarily, but that competition will continue given that it has bipartisan, given that the view of China as a strategic threat to the United States has bipartisan support, but that the Biden administration will be more responsible about pursuing such competition and not necessarily seek to inflame tensions. And in that respect, perhaps it might gain wider buy-in in my part of the world, at least, which was despite some positive actions on the Trump administration's part, was quite worried that the United States and China were heading head-on into a collision course. So that's just my brief response to Professor Chellaney's point. Now, in response to today's question, namely whether a shifting focus on the Indo-Pacific poses the key to containing China, I'll state my main arguments up front before briefly unpacking them in the context of Southeast Asia. So first, my view is that a focus on the Indo-Pacific will not in and of itself contain China, and whether this succeeds will depend on the attractiveness of the Indo-Pacific vision. So whether it's a free and open Indo-Pacific vision or something else, is that something that is able to garner buy-in in Southeast Asia? It will also depend, or any part of the world, it will also depend on strategy, whether there's a clear strategy to align action with goals. So that's my first point. My second broad point is that, and this is linked to the question of vision and buy-in, containment of China might not be the best way of framing goals. While many Southeast Asian countries want to curb China's worst excesses, including its behavior in the South China Sea, which affects many of the Southeast Asian countries' rice bowls, they do not want to be caught up in containing China's rise, not least because many of these countries have also benefited from this economic rise. Now, in order to gain wider traction, my view is that the objective of an Indo-Pacific vision and strategy should not be framed as one that seeks to at least overtly contain China, which few countries are willing to do, but rather would be better framed as one that seeks to defend and promote a rules-based international order, including respect for international law. And I believe in this respect, I'm in line with what Baroness Francis de Souza mentioned a little bit earlier. So let me now unpack my two main arguments in relation to Southeast Asia. Now, there's no doubt that there have been worrying developments in the region. In the South China Sea, which is an area I work closely on, China has been relentless in seeking to strengthen its territorial claims as well as maritime control of the South China Sea. Its activities have not halted in the midst of a pandemic, but have arguably intensified. Its actions in the South China Sea range from encroaching upon coastal states' exclusive economic zones. This has involved survey activities in the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines, Vietnam, and more recently, Malaysia. It's also involved, some say, deliberate collisions with Vietnamese as well as Filipino fishing vessels. Such activities are in clear contravention of the International Tribunal ruling in the Philippines case against China in 2016 and problematic in whatever way we look at it. Now, second, China has also maintained a near constant presence around features occupied or administered by other countries in the South China Sea, including the largest feature the Philippines occupies in the Spratlys. At certain points, we have hundreds of Chinese vessels surrounding such features. And a third way in which China's actions in the South China Sea has been problematic has been its objections to lawful assertions of maritime rights and freedoms of the United States and its allies and partners. And we've seen several near misses in the South China Sea, which are, of course, hugely concerning. Now, Southeast Asia has sought to resist Chinese incursions. They've sent vessels in response to encroachments into the EEZ. An important development in the past year has also been a flurry of diplomatic notes to the United Nations, where countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have all taken the position, either explicitly or implicitly, that the UN tribunal ruling in the Philippines case against China was an authoritative interpretation of the law, and that China's maritime claims in the South China Sea completely contravened the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Their resistance, however, has been carefully calibrated. Vietnam sends Coast Guard rather than naval vessels to resist Chinese encroachments, and Malaysia initially sought to, in fact, deny the presence of Chinese vessels in its EEZ. And Indonesia chooses to respond unilaterally to China's encroachments into its EEZ, rather than seeking to forge a strong and forward-leaning response within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Recently, President Duterte's speech to the UN in September 2020 was lauded for a more forward-leaning approach towards China, and was seen as a rebuke to China. But the president's spokesperson on the very next day actually walked back the president's speech, saying that the South China Sea was not the sum total of the Philippines' relationship with China, and that the Philippines' position in the South China Sea remained unchanged. So quite a cautious approach from all Southeast Asian countries in terms of responding to China's expansive claims. I think by and large, Southeast Asian countries want to maintain good ties with China, and the pandemic, in my view, has only increased this imperative for sound relations as they seek vaccines from China, as well as the ability to work together to have the economies recover post-pandemic. Now, in line with this approach, there's been a very limited buy-in in Southeast Asia to the concept of the Indo-Pacific, which China, of course, obviously despises. When the concept was first resurrected by the Trump administration at the end of 2017, Southeast Asia refrained from endorsing the term. They questioned what the term meant for ASEAN centrality, but more than that, I think they were worried about the United States doing an about turn on the Indo-Pacific, leaving ASEAN exposed to China should the US change its mind about it subsequently. And this, I think, goes to Professor Chellaney's point about how viable it is to have a different vision of the Indo-Pacific under the Biden administration, and how that might scare off potential allies and partners. Now, several years down the road, though the Indo-Pacific concept has gained momentum, regional reservations remain. And I think this can be largely explained in one word: China. Most of the countries in the region are sensitive to China's view of the Indo-Pacific strategy as one of containment. Although some analysts point to the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific document issued in June 2019 as an example of the region's acceptance of the Indo-Pacific concept, I think the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, AOIP, was largely an Indonesian-driven outcome, and it was in Jakarta's view, the Indo-Pacific is also a nod to Indonesia's role, as much as it is a nod to India's important role in the Indo-Pacific. Other countries such as Singapore, Vietnam, etc., went along with the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific quite reluctantly, and continue in national statements to use the terminology of Asia-Pacific. I think even if we look at the AOIP, the document is very nuanced and does not represent a clear endorsement of the Indo-Pacific concept. What it does is it focuses on economic and other areas of cooperation, as well as connectivity, and it does not mention the quadrilateral security dialogue and its more muscular associations. It also does not take sides with the United States and its allies on the one hand, or China on the other hand. Rather, it balances references to the Indo-Pacific with a recognition of the importance of infrastructure development to the region. And in this respect, it's tilting its hat to China and its Belt and Road Initiative. Even its reference to the Indo-Pacific suggests a certain distancing from the concept. The document is the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and not ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So a sort of distancing approach taken there. And I think this has been pointed out by several diplomats that I've spoken to in the region. Notably, what the AOIP does is to reassert ASEAN centrality in principles, such as respect for sovereignty and non-intervention, and also a stress on the importance of respect for international law. I think an Indo-Pacific vision and strategy, which is consistent with this ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, would stand a better chance of gaining support in the region. Critically, I think the Indo-Pacific vision and strategy should frame its goals less about support for one superpower over the other or about containment, and more about support for the rule of law. The challenge, of course, for the United States is that the recently declassified US strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific, which Lord Bruce mentioned at the outset, makes clear that the US goal in the Indo-Pacific is to maintain its strategic primacy. I think while most countries in the region would not quarrel with an attempt to defend a rules-based international order, they want less to do with attempts or US attempts to maintain its strategic primacy in the region. It doesn't object to it, of course, but I think its view of its national interests to the country's views of its national interests are to really support a rules-based international order rather than support one power over the other. Now, beyond an inclusionary framing, the Indo-Pacific's vision and strategy to be successful also has to have a strong economic component. I think the US and its allies to varying degrees understand that. I think Japan was the first to understand the importance of the economy to the region, and its Indo-Pacific vision clearly sets out as one of its three components the importance of economic development. The US, I think the recently declassified strategic framework also understands the importance of the economy to the region, but I think the main challenge would be to ensure that this understanding translates into reality. China's Belt and Road, while it has received flag, not least because of Hambantota Port, is still received by Southeast, is still welcomed cautiously, but welcomed nonetheless by Southeast Asia, which has intense infrastructure needs and development needs. Given the pandemic, I think there's also been renewed interest in China's Health Silk Road, and I think that's a space that we should be watching in the future as well. Finally, I think I'll just touch on talk about, focus on ideology. I think this was highlighted at the outset by Lord Bruce as well. I think it was from the Financial Times, urging a focus on ideology in this competition vis-a-vis China. But I think that from the region's perspective would be quite worrying for at least three reasons. First, it could unnecessarily deepen tensions between the United States and China. Second, it could alienate potential partners. Secretary Pompeo actually made a very strong speech at the Nixon Library condemning the Chinese Communist Party and criticizing all communists as being liars on the very same day that the United States entered into an agreement or memorandum of understanding to cooperate against illegal intimidation at sea. I cannot imagine that his speech would have been well received in Vietnam, an important partner to the United States and many of its allies in the region. And finally, the third problem with an undue focus on ideology would be that it opens strategic space to China, which could in turn be counterproductive insofar as seeking to consolidate democratic gains in the region. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I was entranced by what you were saying. I just wanted to ask you a bit more. You used a very interesting phrase about Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. You said there was very little buy-in to the idea. But is it the case, or am I reading it wrong, that there's very little buy-in in Southeast Asia generally to the lot of these points that are hitting nerves in Western democracies? So the Hong Kong issue, for example, the Xinjiang issue, even Taiwan's slightly apart from that because it's got an interest in getting it. But these things that are being debated in our Western democracies and bringing in sanctions and this and that and the other are not really what Southeast Asia is about, is it? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think you are quite right to say there is less concern amongst many circles in Southeast Asia to issues like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, etc., and more sympathy for China from the perspective of some here. Hong Kong, Taiwan, these are internal matters, and China is doing what any government would do. So that's the perspective in some quarters in the region. And of course, it's a very pragmatic region, right? To the region, and this has been stated many times, to the region, economics is security. And security is paramount to the region, given how, it's many countries in the region are still developing, etc. So the premium really is about economics and how China offers up the hope of further development, whether through infrastructure or healthcare, etc. And this is not something to be scoffed at.
So how does it? Because when we were Lady D'Souza, we discussed this a little bit. When the new Biden administration, possibly Britain, because we're going to Dr. Neil Melvin after this, rides into the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, flying this flag for democracy and human rights, how is that going to be taken? Are people going to say, well, we better sign up to this because we need American protection, but they sort of resent it? I mean, what is the thought that is going through the minds of the businesses and the politicians and the people on the street when this democracy message starts coming through, when they've seen Iraq, they've seen the Cold War, they've seen all the rest of it?
I think they will be pragmatic. They will work with whichever, I think this was stated recently by an official, they will work with whichever administration they have to work with and hold their noses if necessary. They didn't say this is my paraphrasing. But certainly it's viewed with a certain degree of wariness. I mean, it's one thing to have the Biden administration insist on certain rights, human rights, etc., within the country. But it would be quite another thing. I think they would be even more worried should the Biden administration determine that its allies and partners must be democracies, right? So that leaves it at the sole mercy of a very powerful neighbor, and a neighbor which it has stuck out its neck in certain respects to because of the United States. So, I mean, this flurry of diplomatic notes was in part prompted, I think, because they felt that the Trump administration, for whatever reason, and I think there was no altruism in this, and they understood that the Trump administration had its back now because of U.S.-China competition. So it could afford to be more forward-leaning in terms of its diplomatic notes to the United Nations as well. But if the Biden administration fails to offer it such cover because it's nitpicking on human rights and other issues, then that's going to be a worrying development. I do not mean to say that human rights are not important. I think they are. I think they are absolutely important, and so is democracy. But in order to achieve greater buy-in in the region of human rights and democracy, I think a more nuanced approach is certainly necessary. It can't be about just flying the flag.
Yeah, that black and white approach of freedom and liberty and all that. Because I mean, I was having a conversation with somebody and a friend in Indonesia when the Hong Kong thing, or during that, and I said, well, what do you think about the Hong Kong issue? And he said, what are they talking about? We've had to put up with this rubbish all the time. We've got corrupt governments, we've got dictators, we've got the military coming in and out of everything. They've had it easy. They're Asians. And I ran this past a few people, and they said, yeah, that's basically the view is, and that gets me back, I wrote it down here, Brahma's phrase, is that Southeast Asia, essentially, those smaller countries there, Thailand's a military dictatorship, Singapore is whatever it is, Malaysia, Brunei is a sultanate, and then you've got the new democracies of Indonesia and the Philippines. All of Southeast Asia has to carry out a managed coexistence with whatever other powers and neighbors are around. It is a managed coexistence region, isn't it?
Yes, and I don't see managed coexistence as being a problem. I don't even necessarily see that as ceding, democracy to China or anything. I think a managed coexistence is what we should all be aiming for, or in the words of the title of that piece, competition without catastrophe. You compete smartly, but let's try not to blow ourselves up in the process.
Yeah. And I think Brahma was talking about hegemony between two powers and everybody else subservient to them. But we're now going to Geneva, where Dr. Neil Melvin, Director of International and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute, is going to, I don't know what this is, you're going to sort of throw an iron in the fire in a way, and you're going to tell us how Britain, post-Brexit global Britain, is going to or not going to navigate the increasingly tense waters of the Indo-Pacific. What should be its role, if any? Britain that China remembers from the beginning of the Opium Wars, how is all that going to go down? Over to you, Neil.
Yeah, hi, Humphrey, and thank you very much for inviting me to this extremely interesting and timely discussion. And as you say, I mean, I've taken on the rather thorny issue of the UK's emerging role. Now, concerns about China have arisen at the same time, as you mentioned, that the UK has left the EU and embarked on crafting the Global Britain agenda. And I think the two issues have become fused in quite a remarkable way in the UK foreign policy debate. And China has really emerged as a defining issue for the UK debate. And we see this, that there's a remarkable consensus between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, the government and the opposition, that China is a threat. And of course, I think this also reflects the bipartisanship that we see between Democrats and Republicans in the United States. There may be nuances about how to approach the China issue, but there is a consensus that China represents perhaps the leading international threat. We've of course seen key issues in the UK consciousness, namely the Hong Kong issue, the violation of the agreement by the Chinese government, and such that the potential immigration of 1 million or more Hong Kong citizens to the UK is largely seen in positive terms, whereas you had a very acrimonious debate about EU migration for many years, which has been far less positive. We've, of course, got a growing movement in the UK around the human rights question in China. We've heard a bit about that already. I'm particularly focused on the Uyghur community. There's growing concern in the UK about China's economic behavior, and particularly its domination of technology sector. So the Huawei issue has been a major catalyst for seeing China as a threat, and the use of technologies for spying and intelligence gathering is a key issue. And I think feeding into this mix for the UK discussion, of course, has been China hasn't helped its case in that we've had the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, which has taken quite an aggressive line towards the UK and certainly hasn't helped, I think, sell China's positions, and of course the position on the South China Sea in particular. But despite all of this consensus about China as a threat, and I think a growing public debate, the UK still lacks a strategy on China. Much of what happens in the UK is a reaction to particular issues, and we've seen that in the last few days, which we had a binary debate, human rights versus trade, again, a reactive discussion. But the UK hasn't clearly forged a strategy of what it really wants from China, what the UK, as a middle power with considerable assets, but of course very far from the Indo-Pacific region and very far from China, what it can realistically achieve, and what time frame we're talking about for making those achievements. And lastly, then, what is the best mix and balance of tools to achieve these aims? So how can the UK balance across its sort of considerable assets to actually try and achieve realistic change? Because presumably the UK vision is to move China towards being a more responsible international actor, including strengthening deterrence, and also bringing about domestic reforms, but nonetheless working with China where the UK needs to on issues such as climate change. And of course, we are bound by China economically. We've seen that in the pandemic, in that we wouldn't have been able to deal with the PPE issue without supplies from China. So how do we get around that? Now, the UK is conducting an integrated review of its defence and security policies, which I think is going to offer a clearer vision on some of these issues. At least it's to be hoped. And it's been trailed that the UK will have an Indo-Pacific tilt, but it's unclear what exactly that's going to look like. Up to now, the public debate has been very, I would say, China-centric, a focus on the Indo-Pacific as a way of dealing with China, and quite a strong focus on military tools. And we're going to see in probably the next few months a lot of attention, UK sending an aircraft carrier group to the Indo-Pacific region. Personally, I'm hoping the integrated review will correct some of these imbalances in the public debate for a number of reasons. Firstly, because the UK, obviously, since it's left the EU, now needs to craft a broad foreign policy engagement around the world. It's facing a number of threats, including China, but not just China. The world that the UK is facing is a much more complex one than the Cold War. It's not going to be a bipolar struggle. It's not going to be a G2 world, although, of course, the United States and China are going to have a dominant role. But there are many other actors who are emerging, including close to our own shores, Russia, Turkey taking on a stronger role, the Gulf states. So we have to deal with a lot of different issues. So China needs to be integrated into this wider agenda, and its importance and the type of approach needs to reflect the diversity of UK interests. So China's strategy is not just about China, and it shouldn't be reactive. And if we want to achieve real change in terms of China, we need to put together a range of issues and a range of tools that can achieve a realistic shift. Thirdly, why I think we need to change the debate is because it's clear that we cannot contain China. That's neither a realistic or a desirable policy. China is too big. It's too integrated into the rest of the world. So I say it's not like the Soviet Union, which could be isolated and indeed pursued policies of isolation. And as I think we've seen from the previous speaker, Lynn, that would damage many of the regional allies that the United Kingdom wants to cultivate and develop relations with. And it's quite likely that this would indeed produce a far more fragmented world if we were to produce or pursue a policy of containment. China would set off on creating parallel structures and would have an even more difficult and perhaps dangerous world to deal with. So we have to put together a diverse set of policies around deterrence and also cooperation with China that can achieve our aims. And lastly, why I think we need to move beyond some of the public debate in the UK is because the Indo-Pacific is more important to the UK than just China. We shouldn't collapse the Indo-Pacific into a China policy. That would minimize the opportunities of the region to the UK. It would overlook many of the complexities of the region. The Indo-Pacific on its security side is not just about China. There are many other issues: nuclear proliferation, sub-regional rivalries and conflicts that are going to need to be managed in a careful way. And China, of course, runs through many of these issues in quite a difficult way. That suggests that we're going to have to develop a policy that is more nuanced than simply containment. So I think that the UK needs to come with a more positive Indo-Pacific agenda, including a way to manage China. And managing China, of course, is not just about focusing on China. We need a wider vision than that. Now, the UK already has considerable assets across the Indo-Pacific, security and defense assets, a vibrant trade and economy relationship, partners and alliances. And of course, it has a long-standing commitment to protecting the rules-based order as a P5 UN power, responsibilities around Hong Kong. So this is an important platform already for that positive agenda. And China policy needs to be an organic part of this basket of issues. The UK also needs to develop its own vision of the Indo-Pacific. I think you were speaking about how vast the Indo-Pacific is, potentially from Kilimanjaro to California, as they say. The UK's interests do not span all of that region. And I think in some ways the center of gravity may lie more around the Red Sea, the Gulf, the Northern Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and alliances sort of around that hub and spoke set of areas. And I think, as Lynn highlighted, many in the region are looking to the UK not just around deterrence issues, but as a partner that can work on other issues, softer security questions, using the UK's soft power diplomacy as a way to achieving some of our aims without necessarily confronting China in what may be a destabilizing way. So I think when you look across the region, the key for the UK's role is going to be a variable geometry approach, which is going to be about constraining China in some areas, encouraging cooperation in others, and above all, I think building partnerships, because the UK without partnerships in the Indo-Pacific is going to be quite a muted voice and quite a muted force for good. And we also face a number of cross-cutting issues. So I think that we've touched upon this. We're going to need to look at different partnerships with different countries. Values and governance is going to be appropriate for some countries, and we see this in the potential formation of a D10 grouping, the UK looking at its chairmanship of the G7 to begin that embryonic discussion where we can build relations with like-minded democracies around rule of law questions, around democracy and human rights. We're also going to have to look at coalitions around economic questions. The Indo-Pacific is a fantastic opportunity for the UK to promote its growth, develop new technologies with partners, and this needs to be done, of course, to balance China's domination in some of those areas, but also we're going to need to engage with China on some issues, economic issues, and indeed I think this is a positive confidence-building mechanism in the right circumstances. We need to expand regional trade. Thirdly, there's a technology question. Obviously, China has caused concern because it's setting the lead in a number of key technology areas, and it's building national champions. We need to work with others, high technology countries around the next generation of telecoms, computing, AI, these strategic technologies. And lastly, there's a geostrategic coalition of countries that need to put together a package around deterrence and balancing China's power. And not all those countries are going to be democracies. So we're going to have different relations, I think, across the region, depending on the particular coalition that the United Kingdom is going to be working on here. Now, as you've touched on, the US is going to be central. I'm perhaps more optimistic than some. We've heard about the US role on the Indo-Pacific under Biden. I think the Biden administration is going to carry on much of the administration's position on the last few years. There may be, I think, a better approach to issues around economy and trade, and there may be a slightly less confrontational approach to China. But the direction of travel, I think, is clear on the US side, and the UK is going to be with the US on many of those issues. But there's a second group of countries, middle powers, which the UK should very much aim to be part of: Australia, Japan, Indonesia, Canada, perhaps, and South Korea, and develop an engagement with those countries across some of these core areas that I mentioned. The UK-India partnership is going to be a pivotal one for the UK's role in the region. And I think, of course, ASEAN, as we've heard, is also going to be an area where the UK needs to up its game and take account of their interests, but also listen to what ASEAN and other countries in the region want from the UK. So the last point before I come to a couple of conclusions is I think this transatlantic coordination issue that the UK can play on Indo-Pacific also extends to Europe. I mean, the UK is looking for a new relationship to Europe post-Brexit, And I think that actually coming together in a transatlantic discussion on the Indo-Pacific and on China is going to be vital. Otherwise, we risk a major divergence between the EU, the US, and the UK around issues. We've already begun to see that on the normative agenda. The UK has been sort of issuing its statements together with the Five Eyes on Hong Kong. Germany and France have been sort of far less vocal on those questions. We have to heal that gap, and we have to try and bring Europe together with the United States on the region. So to summarize, I think the UK's role in the Indo-Pacific can be to help rebalance the region by bringing together networks, coalitions, partnership, and alliances across a variety of sectors, including the security one. And I think the UK needs to be part of a deterrence framework as it emerges. We also need to rebuild the moral brand of the West, not least the United States. And without preaching democracy and human rights necessarily, we need to at least, I think, get our own house in order and be a force that can legitimately claim this role internationally and in the region, but also advance policies that might not be called democratization, but practically, of course, will be about advancing women's rights, about better governance frameworks, anti-corruption, rule of law, strengthening the media. We need to be part of the new economic dynamism and tap into that in the region and cooperating on new technologies. And lastly, I think the UK has a role as a convener of coalitions in general to bring together this variable geometry. And I'll conclude on that point.
I just wondered if I could ask you, with your international security long-time hat on, it wasn't that long ago, what, 2015 or something, 2010, 2015, that we were in a golden era with China. That the argument was that China was slowly buying into our system and would, over the years, become a democracy. Now, if anybody in the street asks their local MP what China is, they'll say that it's a Leninist, Marxist state. And if they go deeper, they'll start talking about the Holocaust and Xinjiang. This is a very big thing for, an electorate to get their head around, actually. But during that golden era period, what were the intelligence services, the international security people saying, warning about China that the politicians weren't listening to? And what are they saying and warning about China now that the politicians aren't listening to?
Well, I think actually, the intelligence community has been fairly consistent in that they have identified the threats of China, but of course we also need to be careful that we don't overbalance the other way. And if we sort of underestimated China in the past, then we need to also make sure that, as I say, that the threat of China is seen in the spectrum of threats that the UK faces and how we manage them. So, if you look at the trajectory of China, you can see very clearly that its rise has also involved it getting much more abilities to reach beyond its immediate neighborhood with its military, and that's going to continue. I think the security services are clear that we're going to see China having a military footprint that extends in the next decade into the Indian Ocean much more strongly. We're going to see a stronger naval presence in that region. We're going to see Chinese military bases beginning to grow. Of course, they have one in Djibouti. They may have access to Gwadar in Pakistan and to, of course, these mixed civilian military facilities in Sri Lanka and other places. That's going to extend. But of course, others are engaging in this game too. Russia, the Gulf countries, and still the balance, if you looked around the world, the number of overseas military bases that the United Kingdom or the US has vastly dwarfs China's base in Djibouti at this stage. Yeah. So I think we need to put that in perspective. But of course, we mustn't be naive. We need to look at the direction of travel and where China is heading. But I think that at the same time, we have to, China is now number 2 global economy. It's got enormous reach. It's getting more sophisticated. So I think actually that this idea of managed coexistence and the interpretation that Lynn put on that is the right one. This is, of course, is what we ended up with the Soviet Union. There is a power balance in the world that is going to have to be managed, like it or not. And I think rightly, we have to also look at avoiding worst case scenarios. I mean, so a military confrontation with a China that feels perhaps alone, as you said, it has very few friends, is going to be nothing that anybody really wants. So there are opportunities, and as I say, on some issues we need China. But of course, we have to accept that China is not, as you say, I mean, the openings for political reform are pretty limited, and the trajectory of travel seems to be to restrict those even further. So it's going to be a long haul.
I just want to turn it around a moment and put the threat on the other foot, as it were, because throughout the post-war wars of the United States, each of them have been predicated on faulty intelligence. The Yalu River with MacArthur in Korea, Tonkin, in the Gulf of Tonkin with Vietnam, the Gulf War we all know about, and so on and so forth. What is the risk of this democracy, human rights, Xinjiang thing blowing up to the grassroots electorate, and then a piece of false intelligence predicating either a proxy war or some sort of shooting war against, in order to bolster bases back home?
No, I mean, I think that, I mean, there is, of course, I mean, intelligence is not a science, although it's got a lot better in terms of some of the techniques that are being employed, but it's ultimately going to be about human interpretation of these issues and assessments of what the other side is up to. Now, I mean, I think we've got a pretty good evidence base already on what is happening in Xinjiang. And I mean, while there may be a legal debate about whether this is genocide or ethnic cleansing, it's nonetheless clear that China is engaged in extremely unpleasant policies towards the minority, possibly even to eradicate a large part of its culture and some of its people. But we also,
I think I'm asking: is there a safety valve now on this? Or are we heading into another thing where there could be a sort of a viral something happens that's actually not true, and all the politicians said is true, and we have to do something, and or does Britain at least have a mechanism in place to stop that happening now?
Well, I mean, this is why I think we have to keep talking. I mean, you might not like people sometimes, but it's important to talk to them and hear what they are thinking. And so, I mean, and we have a series of mechanisms. There's military-to-military contacts. There's government contacts. Of course, you know, there is the embassy contact, and there is obviously a sophisticated intelligence operation underway. Now, this is why I say we have to, you know, containment would actually damage those communication channels, and they are very important, I think, to manage, you know, a set of nuclear armed countries which are with increasingly putting their militaries nose to nose with each other. So, I mean, this is an issue that we have to manage very, very carefully.
That's great. I'm going to come to you with the next question, but we're now officially in question and answer sessions. And this question is very straightforward, one from Noel Hadji-Michael, who also is the chair of the Defence and Security Forum at the National Liberal Club. And he says, is the UK a potential fifth wheel for the Quad? Neil, you first, then I'd like to come to Lynn on that.
I mean, I think that the UK and the Europeans need to step up their game, and indeed, I think the Quad, you know, become in some way engaged in the Quad. Now, the UK is not going to be able to deploy regular military forces in significant amounts to the region. I mean, it just doesn't have the capabilities to do that. But we can make an important periodic commitment, including, as we see with this carrier strike group, and our military presence, training, perhaps some form of forward deployed naval assets in the future. So I think together with France and with other Europeans, this is an area where we can make a difference. And it's not necessarily, of course, about high-end war fighting. It's also about reassurance and then, of course, about establishing a deterrence in the region, which will balance China. So I agree. I would like to see the UK as part of the Quad. We've got, I think, an emerging important security relationship with India already happening. Japan and Australia are keen, I think, for the UK to step up its security role. But that also needs to be done, as I say, while being sensitive to some of the other countries in the region who are cautious about a militarization of the Indo-Pacific and a growing confrontation. This needs to be done in a very careful way, in which it's also situated in a diplomatic context.
Not talking about Empire 2, as they did straight after the Brexit thing in the corridors of Whitehall. Lynn, very, very quickly, should Britain join the Quad? And also, I'm going to throw into that, should Japan join the Five Eyes? What's your view in a brief answer?
I think it makes, well, I can view this question from the perspective of Quad members, and I think the answer to that would be a definite yes. I think there's enough shared values and interest in stability and the rules-based order in the region for the UK to join the Quad. From the perspective of the region, it's a slightly more nuanced answer, but I think by and large, I think the region would welcome greater UK presence in the region, whether it's through the Quad or not. I think Neil was right in saying that if it joins as a formal member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, this needs to be done delicately and sensitively to the region that doesn't want to see powers go head to head against each other. But I think in terms of a UK presence, certainly an economic presence will be welcome. But also from the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue's perspective, the UK can play a greater role in terms of freedom of navigation operations. I don't really like that term because I think the UK and other powers actually secure more than just the freedom to navigate, but other high sea freedoms as well as passage rights. So regular UK assertions of maritime rights and freedoms would be welcome in the region to ensure that rights aren't lost under international law, as well as to ensure that the South China Sea doesn't de facto become a Chinese lake. So that's why the UK as an FPDA member can also play an important role in terms of working with allies and partners to build capacity in the region. But I think the most
alliance, isn't it? Yes.
I think the most important thing for the UK is to have a clear sense of its purpose, so its interests and priorities in the region. That will help it circumvent some of the skepticism that the region views the UK currently, because I think most of them will see Brexit on the UK's hands, other challenges on the UK's doorsteps. And if it doesn't have a clear sense of interests and priorities in the region, I think the region would be very hesitant to welcome it to play a more regular role in it, especially if it demands statements like, "Oh, let's have a base in Singapore, Brunei, under the previous administration."
Great. I just wanted to put that question to Brahma Chellaney as well, whether India welcomes British gunboats or that's out there as part of an alliance. But also there's another question that's come in, Brahma. So if you could answer the UK's military role briefly. Another question from Philip Bowman in London. Half of the world's Muslims live in the Indo-Pacific. So how might China's mistreatment of the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims in Xinjiang be addressed by the region, given the very large, Muslim population in South Asia? What is your response to that as well?
So should I go ahead first?
Yes, if you just briefly about the UK and the Quad, and then the one about the Muslims.
Well, the Quad is still not a formal institution, and the idea is to first formalize it as an institution and then to expand it. Expansion will include European powers eventually, and the UK certainly would be an important addition to the Quad. France is keen to work with the Quad. It is already seeking to play an increasing role in the Indo-Pacific like the UK. So UK and France would be obvious new members once the Quad is formalized and expanded. The issue is whether the Quad will survive under Biden, because the Biden administration approach toward Indo-Pacific will determine the Quad's future.
That's Biden, a great point.
Biden so far has not uttered the word Quad. Quad is the official name of this grouping, but we have not heard from Biden. And he's been talking about so many different issues, but he hasn't spoken about the Quad even once. So I think before we discuss Britain's possible entry to the Quad,
Premature, is it?
we need to have a clearer picture about the Quad's own future.
And the region and the Xinjiang and the Muslim question, what should the region do on this issue, in your view?
You're asking me?
Yes, I'm asking you, Brahma.
Well, I think, what's happening in Xinjiang is something that should have shocked the world, because we have more than 1 million Muslims incarcerated. This is the largest religious persecution since the Nazi era. And this persecution in Xinjiang has essentially gone unpunished.
Yeah.
Now, we talk about the rule of law or building a rules-based order, but we are seeing actions that actually go contrary to a rules-based order. For example, China's open violation of its binding commitment to Hong Kong's autonomy, or take the international arbitral ruling on the South China Sea. That was in 2016, 4.5 years ago.
There's no way of policing an international order if people don't buy into it. Thanks for that, Brahma. I just want to take that question to Lady de Souza, who I see is back from the House of Lords chamber. In fact, if you could handle both, if you could handle the Muslim Xinjiang question and that rule of law thing, but there's also another one that has come in from Win Min Tor in Myanmar. Is it possible for the shared strategic and security visions of the US and its allies to be sustained? And I think what we're talking about here is, given the election that we're discussing from Trump to Biden, how can the people of the region be sure of a sustained policy that's going to go through several decades that it needs? Lady de Souza.
I mean, that's one of the big problems. But can I go back to the Uyghurs for a minute?
Yes, please. Yes.
Brahma has said, that the world should be shocked. I think the world is shocked. The reason why there isn't as sustained headlines in the papers each and every day and on the online media is because no one knows what to do. And this goes back to, the heart of our discussion is what kind of coalitions and coordination and pacts and trade agreements that we can make amongst the established and incipient democracies in the region in order to provide a united front. And what are the obstacles to that? I mean, I would very much like to know what, the team of panels, or indeed anyone outside and beyond, thinks could be done. We have, for instance, in the UK Parliament, questions virtually every other day about this. The minister has to stand and answer and ask what the UK response is. And I suppose that this will come up at the forthcoming G7 meeting. But none of that will really bear any fruit until we really do get down to having proper coordinating plans and setting up some kind of a sort of council which agrees on a way forward. At the moment, China is extremely well aware that we are in disarray. We're in total disarray.
But does this not get us to the question of the sustained policy that Win Min Tor comes from Myanmar, is that we're now getting a complete switch. It's going to take some time for the new administration to get in and then get its relationships with us and Europe together. Whereas, as you rightly say, there should be something that we know we can do when you have debates about genocide going on in Western democracies.
Yeah, and I mean, Myanmar being a very, very, very important case. Again, you see, I think that you've got to start somewhere. Where is a good way to start? I think we all agreed that sort of, constantly harping on about sort of democracy, et cetera, is not a fair way forward. Constantly becoming increasingly vehement and in our rhetoric against China is going to make them more defensive. I think that we've got to start somewhere. Maybe the start would be some kind of a multinational agreement between, say, UK, USA, and the established democracies in the region, that there will be investment in trade partnerships, and some sort of, some kind of rule of conduct, standards achieved and set and agreed to, whereby these agreements would be kept to. I know that sounds almost impossible, but if you're thinking about where you would start, surely the most important thing is to actually get a coalition of the willing. And there are some willing people. And once the willing have actually spoken out and put their money where their mouths are, then perhaps others will join in. I think that the other thing, I'd like to know what Lynn talked about, sort of being clear about the sort of particular interests that the UK should pursue in the Indo-Pacific region. I'd love to know what she actually thinks those interests should be.
Why don't we hand over to Lynn? You've got 1 minute to answer that question, and then we're going to go to Barry Gardiner. Could you answer that?
Well, I think the UK interest in the Indo-Pacific would be consistent. I would frame it in the same way that I framed US interest in the Indo-Pacific, namely to ensure a rules-based international order and adherence to international law and norms. And I think that's the overarching framing mechanism, and then within that adherence to the rules-based order in order to secure UK's security as well as economic interests in the region. So I would have that broad umbrella, and then after that, it's security and economic interests. So that's the road to Rome in a sense, right?
I agree.
Okay, great. Thank you that was very concisely summed up. And thank you everybody on the panel there for that. I'm now going to go to Barry Gardiner, who's been waiting all ears to everything that's been said, and he's going to encapsulate what all of us has put into this in his inimitable way. Barry, sum up the debate for us, please. And you need to be unmuted, I think.
There we go. What a challenge you set me. Oh dear. Let me start by saying this. Thank God that today we have, being inaugurated in Washington, the oldest person ever to become president of the United States. And I say that because, not just because Joe Biden is somebody who is known for his stance in the Senate as trying to be someone who brings people together, who works across the aisle. I say it because older, particularly men, are always, I think, less likely as leaders to favor conflict. And I think it's an important feature of where we are at the moment, and it's been very amply expressed this afternoon, that there is fear, there is tension, there is security concerns, and what we need to do, I think, is to de-escalate them, not to escalate them. And I was very struck by actually two of the contributions that were made in the chat room. One by Phil Bowman, which you alluded to, Humphrey, and also that of Win-Min Thaw. And they raised those key questions about the attitude of countries in Southeast Asia with Muslim majorities or just very large Muslim populations towards China. And Win-Min Thaw talked of how a policy would be possible given different Indo-Pacific political and religious values. And so one of the features that I think we need to overlay in this discussion is the tensions that can come from religious as well as political values here. And I thought it was really good that those contributors from our audience, as it were, brought that out in a way that I don't think had been adequately brought out in the panel. Now, Lord Bruce started off talking about containment, and he said Beijing seeks to weaken and divide us while stuffing our mouths with cash. That was a quote I think he used from the New Zealander, Brady. But then if we think, well, what is the policy of containment that we're talking about? Containment is precisely to try and isolate externally whilst dividing internally. So I do think we have to have a sense of equanimity here, a sense of humility, a sense of self-perception here, that we're not condemning in others what we may seek to be doing ourselves. And Francis, I thought, spoke very powerfully about the illiberal actions of the Chinese government in Hong Kong, and talked about the way in which they were making infrastructural investments in weaker economies. And she obviously mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. But there is a huge question for the global north, or Western democracies, whatever you want to call it, or Europe and America. Why are we not able to incentivize countries and invest in those countries in as attractive a way as China is doing? And that goes right the way through China's involvement in Pakistan, through the Middle and Near East, and down the whole of East Africa in the Belt and Road Initiative. We have failed there to put together an adequate response to the development needs of those countries, and it is therefore unsurprising that China is stepping into that breach and taking advantage of that. That reflects very badly on the way in which we've approached this, I think. She also talked about the role that trade had to play in this, and latterly referenced the debates that we've had. But of course, we've just had a debate in the House of Commons yesterday in which our government refused point blank to take human rights into account in trade deals. So again, we need to look at the way in which we're engaging here. If we don't want military engagement, economic engagement is the way in which we can exert influence. And if we're not prepared to use that economic influence for fear of the economic repercussions of it, and obviously those are huge, given certainly for America, given the economic ties with China, and also with the UK, then there are real problems in sitting on a high horse but not being able to ride in battle because you're afraid of the consequences. Brahma, you posed me some really powerful questions here. You talked of no managed coexistence with Beijing, and said that was really important, and there needed to be an overhaul of America's policy so that there was no managed coexistence. I just found myself thinking, well, what's the alternative to managed coexistence? I suppose it's unmanaged non-existence. Well, that is war, isn't it? Unmanaged non-existence. I don't want anything other than managed coexistence, but I don't see that I thought it was a false dichotomy to say that managed coexistence had to rule out a free and open approach. And I think you painted those as if they were mutually exclusive. I'm not convinced that they are in the way that you suggested. In that respect, I lent much more to what Lynn Kuok was saying. It seemed to me that having that perspective, which Lynn was able to put into this conversation, was very important. And I thought, Lynn, you dodged beautifully the question about whether the UK should be part of the Quad, by saying, well, yeah, from the Quad's point of view, sure, maybe not quite so sure from the point of view of Southeast Asia. I think on balance you came down in favor. But I thought it was really important to get that, to characterize that skepticism which exists for the UK, not only for the way in which its history in the region and the whole history of colonialism is one which will obviously tend to lead people to think, well, what are the UK's interests? Why is it getting involved here in this way? But also in terms of the UK's own strategic priorities. And I thought it's very helpful the way that you also were able to say that ASEAN's view of what was happening over Hong Kong and over Taiwan was that they viewed these as internal matters within China, not as matters for the external world to be interfering with. And Neil, when you really hit the nail on the head when you said, well, the UK doesn't have a strategy for China, and it doesn't. And unless we do develop a strategy, unless we do know what our aims and objectives are in engagement around the world, then we're going to find this global Britain that the government speaks of increasingly hollow. And actually, we shouldn't now be thinking about what global Britain means. Before we left the European Union was the time that we should have been thinking about what global Britain meant and what we wanted to do on the world stage that necessitated our no longer being part of the European Union. I thought Humphrey posed you some pretty tough challenges, and I'm not sure that you answered them fully. When he talked about the false intelligence that had led to various key conflicts over the past half century. And in this, our intelligence services have not always had a distinguished role. It's been distinguished in one way, but not an honourable one necessarily. So I think we've had a lot of big words thrown around this afternoon: autocracy, democracy, security, free, open, rules-based, prosperity. If we want a rules-based society, let's look at who the great disruptors of that rules-based society have been. Just look at the WTO over the past 20 years. Some of the biggest disruptors in that rules-based order have actually been the United States in the refusal to respond to the need for further appellate judges. The way in which there has been that undermining of a rules-based order. I think there is a certain inevitability, I fear, about the big two and them seeking to live with each other. I think it is inevitable because of the way in which so much of American industry is dependent and owned by Chinese finance and the interrelation between the two. I think on security matters, we're going to find it deeply uncomfortable if we pursue an aggressive policy towards China. I do think that we need to look at India as the country which only last year had conflict, albeit with clubs and sticks and stones on its border with China. And of course, there was the accusation that shots were fired across the border for the first time since, I think, 1966. What's happening there is a standoff. It's to do with trade. And I think the way in which we should be working these things out now is actually by setting clear rules of trade that we expect people to stand by, and that is where the rules-based order must take effect. Humphrey, back to you.
Thank you, Barry. I can see a black box where I meant to be, but we'll leave the technicians to sort out. It's just to say thank you, everybody, for coming. You can't see me, but you can hear me. We've had an exceptionally good debate. So thank you, Baroness Frances de Souza, Professor Brahma Chellaney, Dr. Lynn Kuok, Dr. Neil Melvin, Barry Gardiner, and Lord Charles Bruce. Subscribe to Democracy Forum's sister publication, Asian Affairs, and look up for our seminar next month on an equally intriguing international issue. And until then, thank you wherever you are in the world. Enjoy the inauguration, if that's the right word, and thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.
Mm-hmm.